It was just after midnight in the West Midlands when I first understood why this car had started to frighten people. The motorway was quiet in the way British motorways often are after dark. Long stretches of empty tarmac, and then, in the distance, I saw blue lights. Not one set. Several police cars were scattered across the carriageway like they'd suddenly remembered an urgent appointment somewhere up ahead. Sirens were bouncing off the concrete barriers, echoing across the empty road. And then something else appeared. At first, it looked completely ordinary. Just a dark green saloon moving quickly in the outside lane. The sort of thing you'd normally expect to see parked outside an office block in Wolverhampton. But this one wasn't behaving like a company car, because the moment the police lights got close, the driver put his foot down. The engine note hardened. The rear of the car squatted slightly, and then the thing simply disappeared. Not gradually, not in the slow, dramatic way cars usually pull away during police chases. It vanished. Within seconds, the gap between it and the pursuing police car stretched into something almost embarrassing. Blue lights flashing furiously in the distance, while the green saloon calmly continued into the night as if none of it had ever happened. Later, police would confirm something rather uncomfortable. They couldn't catch it because the car doing the escaping was capable of nearly 180 miles an hour. And it wasn't a Ferrari, it wasn't a Lamborghini, it was a Vauxhall. This was the Lotus Carlton, and for a brief, slightly chaotic period in the early 1990s, it became the car that convinced Britain something had gone very wrong. Because when criminals started stealing them in the West Midlands, the police discovered a rather awkward truth. Their patrol cars simply weren't fast enough, and politicians began asking a very uncomfortable question: should this thing be legal? This is the story of a car that, for a brief and extraordinary moment in the early 1990s, convinced Britain that civilization might be undone, not by economic collapse, not by political unrest, but by a dark green Vauxhall saloon capable of outrunning almost everything on the road. And before we dive into the turbochargers, the robbery sprees, and the furious newspaper editorials that demanded the thing be banned outright, it's worth holding on to one small detail about what eventually happened to this supposedly dangerous machine, because the ending of this story is wonderfully ironic. We'll come back to that. To understand why Britain became so alarmed by the Lotus Carlton, you first must understand what it looked like, which is to say, not much. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a slightly serious-looking executive saloon, a company car, the sort of thing you might imagine parked outside a regional office in Birmingham, while someone inside discusses quarterly targets over a slightly depressing sandwich. There was no outrageous supercar bodywork, no giant wings, no theatrical mid-engine layout. It was simply a Vauxhall Carlton, a perfectly respectable four-door family car, except Lotus had been involved. And Lotus, when asked to make something faster, has historically responded in the same way a peaky blinder might respond if you asked him to bring a knife to a fistfight. With enthusiasm, the transformation began with the engine. Lotus took a 3.0-litre straight-six from the standard Carlton and increased its displacement to 3.6 litres. They then fitted 2 Garrett turbochargers, strengthened the internals, and attached a 6-speed gearbox borrowed from a Corvette. The result was a figure that caused engineers, and later politicians, to pause slightly. 377 horsepower. Today that might not sound apocalyptic, but in 1990, when most hot hatchbacks were celebrating if they cracked 150 horsepower, this was monstrous. The numbers were extraordinary. 0 to 60 miles per hour in just over 5 seconds. A top speed of 176 miles per hour. To put that into context, The Lotus Carlton was faster than many Ferraris available at the time. It was faster than a Ferrari Testarossa. It was faster than a Porsche 911 Carrera 2964, and it had 4 doors, which meant it could carry a family, or as it would turn out, something rather less wholesome. But first, let's consider where this car came from. The early 1990s were an interesting moment for performance cars. Manufacturers were beginning to realize that you didn't necessarily need a 2-seat exotic machine to produce terrifying speed. Instead, you could take something ordinary, a saloon, an estate car, a family runabout, and quietly transform it into a ballistic missile disguised as office furniture. The Germans were already experimenting with this idea. BMW had the BMW M5 E34, which could cruise down the autobahn at speeds normally associated with small aircraft. But the Lotus Carlton went further. It didn't just match sports cars. It embarrassed them, and that might have been fine if the car had remained a slightly mad engineering experiment, driven only by enthusiasts. Unfortunately for Britain, it didn't, because around the same time the Carlton arrived on British roads, something else was happening, particularly in the West Midlands. Car crime was exploding. High-performance cars were being stolen at an alarming rate. Ram raids were becoming common. Criminal gangs were discovering that a fast getaway vehicle could transform the odds of escape. And suddenly, on the streets of Birmingham, Wolverhampton and Coventry, there appeared a machine capable of something rather inconvenient for law enforcement: outrunning the police. Now imagine the scene. It is late at night somewhere in the West Midlands, the sort of place where industrial estates sit quietly under orange sodium streetlights. Somewhere, perhaps, Thomas Shelby would approve of the atmosphere. All dark coats and quiet menace. A shop alarm sounds. A robbery has taken place. The suspects jump into a stolen Lotus Carlton and accelerate into the darkness. The police give chase. Blue lights flash, sirens wail, and then the Carlton disappears. Not gradually, not slowly, instantly, because the police cars of the time simply weren't fast enough. This was not speculation. It actually happened. During several robberies in the early 1990s, criminals used stolen Lotus Carltons as getaway cars across the West Midlands. Police officers later admitted that the vehicles were capable of speeds their patrol cars simply couldn't match. One notorious incident involved a Carlton reaching speeds estimated at over 160 miles per hour while fleeing officers on the motorway. To put that into perspective, many police cars of the time struggled to exceed 130 miles per hour. It was, in effect, a technological mismatch. The criminals had brought a turbocharged missile. The police had brought something slightly more sensible. And this is where the newspapers entered the story. British tabloids absolutely loved the Lotus Carlton panic. Headlines began appearing suggesting that the car was too dangerous for public roads. Some newspapers described it as a menace to society. Others asked why a family car capable of 176 miles per hour had been allowed to exist at all. One article asked a particularly pointed question: what possible reason does anyone need a car this fast? Politicians soon joined the chorus. Members of Parliament began discussing whether the Lotus Carlton should be banned entirely. Some argued that no road car should be capable of such speeds. Others suggested manufacturers had a responsibility to limit performance. For a brief moment, the idea of banning a specific car model was discussed seriously in Britain, which is a rather extraordinary situation when you think about it. Imagine Parliament debating whether a Vauxhall should be illegal, and yet, in the early 1990s, that is exactly what happened. Of course, car enthusiasts were delighted. To them, the outrage was proof that the Lotus Carlton was something special. It was rebellious, unapologetic, the automotive equivalent of walking into a very quiet room and lighting a cigar the size of a baseball bat. And there was something else that made the car irresistible. It didn't look outrageous. If you parked a Lotus Carlton outside a pub in Birmingham, most people would glance at it and assume it was simply a slightly serious company car. But underneath that understated bodywork was an engine capable of hurling the car toward the horizon with astonishing force. The experience behind the wheel was, by all accounts, dramatic. Below 3,000 revolutions per minute, the engine felt calm, almost polite. Then the turbochargers woke up, and suddenly the rear tires were asked to translate several hundred horsepower into forward motion, while the driver reconsidered their life choices. It was not a subtle experience. Modern performance cars are carefully engineered to deliver power smoothly. Traction control intervenes. Stability systems quietly manage everything. The Lotus Carlton had none of that. It was raw and slightly intimidating, which is exactly why people loved it, because the Lotus Carlton represented something that was becoming increasingly rare even in the early 1990s. Mechanical honesty. It did not hide its performance behind layers of electronics. It simply delivered it, and that meant the driver had to keep up. Naturally, comparisons with other performance cars of the era were inevitable. The BMW M5 offered similar practicality with slightly less drama. The Mercedes-Benz 500e delivered enormous V8 power wrapped in Stuttgart refinement. But the Lotus Carlton had something the others lacked: a reputation. It had become, quite accidentally, the villain of British motoring. Parents worried about it. Insurance companies hated it. Newspapers blamed it for everything from robbery sprees to moral decline. And yet the car itself had done nothing wrong. It had simply been built to go very, very fast. Time, however, has a way of reshaping reputations, because the Lotus Carlton story did not end with controversy. Far from it. Production was limited from the beginning. Just over 900 cars were built. Many were modified. Some were crashed. Others simply disappeared over the decades, which means that today, surviving examples are remarkably rare. And here is the twist. The car, once described as too dangerous for the road, is now one of the most desirable performance cars of its era. Collectors adore it. Auction houses speak about it in reverent tones. Prices that once sat around £40,000 have climbed dramatically, with pristine examples sometimes exceeding £100,000. The very qualities that once terrified politicians, speed, aggression, unapologetic performance, have become the reasons enthusiasts treasure it. The Lotus Carlton did not change. Britain did. Modern performance cars are faster than ever. A family SUV today can reach 60 miles per hour faster than many supercars from the 1990s. Technology has made speed accessible, safe, almost routine. But the Lotus Carlton belongs to a different era. An era when a manufacturer could take an ordinary family car, add twin turbochargers, and release it into the world with minimal electronic supervision. It was bold, it was slightly reckless, and it was unforgettable. In the end, the car Britain once considered banning became something else entirely. A legend, the family car that frightened a nation. And the strange thing is, if Thomas Shelby himself were around today, standing on a Birmingham street corner watching one thunder past, there's a good chance he'd simply smile. Because even in the modern world, there's still something deeply satisfying about a machine that refuses to behave politely.